For 6 months of marriage, he hadn't spoken a single word to me, treating me like I didn't exist. I thought he hated me to the core. Until that day, he hid outside the door and overheard me singing a lullaby to my 3-month-old baby. That arrogant Duke collapsed on the spot. He pushed open the door, knelt before the simple cradle, his voice hoarse as if cut by shards of glass. Charlotte, I chose silence, because I feared that if I opened my mouth, the madness I inherited from my father would wound you like a wild beast. He trembled as he pressed his face against my swollen belly. It was the first time he had touched me, yet it was a plea for me not to leave his abyss. But in the secret diary under his pillow, I discovered the true price behind his silence. Welcome to Luna's secret library. Sometimes the most unexpected turns lead us exactly where we need to be. What happens next is something I never saw coming, and I think you'll find it just as surprising. Stick around for the conclusion. It's a reminder that it's never too late for a new chapter. If you enjoy discovering these hidden gems, I'd be honored to have you follow for more. The heavy oak doors of the grand estate always felt like the gates of a prison. Charlotte stood by the frosted window and watched the snow fall. She was young, widely considered the most beautiful woman in the realm, yet utterly invisible here. 6 months had passed since her wedding day. 6 months since she became the Duchess of Somerset. And in all that time, her husband had never spoken a single word to her. Duke Edward was a man of cold stone and chilling silences. He provided her with immense wealth and absolute isolation. He would take his meals at the opposite end of a sprawling mahogany table. His dark eyes would stare past her, never lingering on her face. Servants whispered that he possessed a heart of pure ice. Others claimed he was cursed to never show affection. Charlotte did not care about the endless manor gossip anymore. She gently placed her hand over her lower abdomen. A soft, secret smile graced her delicate features. She was exactly 3 months pregnant. This tiny, unseen life was her only beacon of hope in this massive, silent tomb. Edward did not know about the child. She had hidden the subtle changes in her body beneath thick winter gowns. She feared what a man devoid of warmth might do to an innocent child. Would he send the baby away to be raised by strict governesses? Would he curse their child with the same agonizing silence he gave her? Charlotte swore to protect this baby with every breath she had. She turned away from the window and walked down the dimly lit corridor. Her footsteps made no sound on the thick Persian carpets. The shadows in the manor seemed to stretch endlessly as evening approached. The flickering candlelight barely pierced the gloom of the massive hallways. Charlotte felt the chill of the stone seep into her bones. Yet, the warmth radiating from her belly gave her a strange, new courage. She slipped into an abandoned room at the end of the east wing. She had spent the last few weeks secretly transforming this dusty space. Now, it was a warm, hidden sanctuary for her unborn baby. A beautifully carved wooden cradle sat in the center of the room. Charlotte sat in the rocking chair beside it and closed her eyes. She remembered the day of their wedding, a grand spectacle devoid of joy. Edward had stood beside her at the altar, looking like a magnificent marble statue. He possessed a striking, harsh beauty that commanded absolute obedience. But his silence had cut deeper than any cruel words ever could. She had tried everything during those first few weeks to win a single glance. Nothing had worked to break through his terrifying indifference. Eventually, she had simply stopped trying to melt the glacier. The immense loneliness of the past 6 months finally began to melt away. She took a deep breath and began to sing. Her voice was a soft, trembling melody that echoed against the stone walls. It was an old folk song her own mother used to sing to her. The tune was filled with warmth, fierce love, and a promise of eternal protection. She sang about the sunlight chasing away the darkest winter shadows. She sang about a mother's love being an unbreakable shield. Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice remained steady and sweet. She did not know that the heavy wooden door was slightly ajar. She did not know that a towering figure stood completely frozen in the shadows of the hallway. Duke Edward had returned early from his hunting trip. He had been searching for his steward when the faint, angelic melody stopped him in his tracks. His broad shoulders tensed as the sweet voice washed over him. He stepped closer to the crack in the door, his heart pounding violently against his ribs. Through the narrow gap, he saw his beautiful, neglected wife. He saw her hands gently cradling her slightly swollen belly. He heard the absolute, pure love radiating from every word she sang to their unborn child. The impenetrable fortress of ice around Edward's heart shattered instantly. His breath caught in his throat, choking him with a sudden, suffocating wave of regret. He had shut her out to protect her from his own dark demons. His father had destroyed his mother with explosive rage and bitter words. Edward had sworn a silent oath to never let that poison spill from his own lips. He thought his distance was a shield, but it had only been a cage. But looking at her now, he realized the magnitude of his terrible mistake. He had starved her of love, and yet she was creating a universe of warmth right here in the cold. He saw a single tear slip down Charlotte's cheek, catching the dim candlelight. That single tear burned his soul worse than hellfire. He could not tear his eyes away from the gentle curve of her stomach. An heir, a child, a delicate piece of the future he thought he had forfeited. The song slowly faded into a gentle, soothing hum. Charlotte whispered a soft promise to the baby, her voice filled with fierce determination. Edward stumbled backward, his hand clutching his chest as if physically struck. The arrogant, unshakable Duke of Somerset suddenly felt like the poorest man on earth. He took a sharp, jagged breath, the first sound he had made near her in half a year. Charlotte's voice hitched suddenly, her body stiffening as she sensed a presence behind her. Edward knew he had to speak to her right now. He knew he had to beg for a forgiveness he fundamentally did not deserve. But as he reached out to push the door open, a terrifying thought paralyzed him. What if she no longer wanted to hear his voice? The heavy wooden door creaked open loudly. Charlotte spun around with a sudden, sharp gasp. Her rocking chair came to an abrupt halt. She instinctively wrapped both arms tightly around her waist. She positioned her body directly between the intruder and the empty wooden cradle. Her eyes widened in pure, unfiltered shock. Duke Edward stepped out of the dark hallway shadows. He looked entirely out of place in this small, dusty nursery. His tall frame practically filled the narrow doorway. For a fraction of a second, Charlotte thought she was hallucinating. Her husband never visited this abandoned East Wing. He never actively sought her out for any reason. Panic quickly replaced her initial wave of surprise. Did he hear her singing the lullaby? Does he know about the unborn baby? Edward took a slow, hesitant step forward. His usually perfect, rigid posture was completely gone. His broad shoulders were slumped forward. His dark eyes were fixed entirely on her stomach. The silence between them felt heavier than ever before. But this time, the silence was not born of his usual coldness. It was born of absolute, paralyzing fear. Charlotte backed away until her shoulders hit the cold stone wall. "Do not come any closer," she commanded. Her voice trembled slightly, but her chin tilted up in defiance. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him in months. Edward flinched backward as if she had physically struck him. He opened his mouth to speak. He desperately wanted to tell her he was incredibly sorry. He wanted to vow that he would protect them both forever. But the words caught painfully in his dry throat. He had built a massive wall of silence for 6 long months. Now, that very wall was suffocating him completely. "Charlotte," he finally croaked out. His voice was rough and gravelly from extreme disuse. It sounded entirely foreign even to his own ears. Charlotte let out a bitter, humorless laugh. So the Duke finally remembers my given name, she whispered. Her tone was coated in a thin layer of protective ice. She had learned this exact defense mechanism directly from him. Edward took another step forward. He reached out a trembling hand toward her. Please, he breathed out quietly. He did not really know what he was asking for. Was he asking for forgiveness? Was he begging for a chance to explain his twisted logic? Charlotte slapped his hand away before he could touch her dress. The echoing smack rang very loudly in the quiet room. Edward froze completely. He stared at his rejected hand in absolute disbelief. Nobody ever dared to strike the powerful Duke of Somerset. But Charlotte did not care about his title or wealth right now. She was not a dutiful duchess at this exact moment. She was a mother protecting her child from a dangerous stranger. Do not touch me, she ordered firmly. Her eyes blazed with a fierce, protective fire. You have ignored my existence for half a year. You let me wander these empty halls like a forgotten ghost. You made me believe I was entirely unworthy of a single word. Edward felt every single word pierce his chest like a sharp dagger. He wanted to explain his terrible fear of his own hidden anger. He wanted to explain the dark shadow of his brutal, abusive father. He wanted to say he thought silence meant absolute safety. But looking at her terrified, defensive posture, his excuses felt pathetic. I heard you singing just now, Edward managed to say. His gaze dropped to her hands again. They were still firmly shielding her womb. A child, he whispered. Or mixed directly with his deep, sudden agony. My child, Charlotte corrected him instantly. She took a deep breath to steady her racing heart. You made it very clear you wanted no part of my life. I will not let you freeze this baby's soul the way you froze mine. Edward fell to his knees on the dusty wooden floorboards. The loud thud echoed sharply against the bare stone walls. Charlotte gasped again. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth in shock. The proud, unbending Duke was actually kneeling before her. His dark head was bowed in complete submission. I was a fool, Edward confessed to the floor. His voice cracked openly. It revealed a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. I thought silence was the only way to keep you safe from my darkness. I was terrified of destroying you like my father destroyed my mother. But my silence was the very thing tearing you apart. Charlotte stared down at the man who had caused her so much pain. Her heart ached slightly at the raw desperation in his rough voice. But 6 months of deep loneliness could not be erased in 1 minute. A simple, desperate apology could not fix a shattered marriage. The damage was already deeply ingrained in her bones. She stepped carefully around his kneeling form. She moved deliberately toward the open door. Your words come much too late, Edward, she said softly. She did not look back at him. I have already learned exactly how to survive without a husband. And this child will learn exactly how to thrive without a father. She slipped quietly out of the nursery. She left him completely alone in the dim light. Edward remained on the floor for a long time. He stared blankly at the empty rocking chair. The faint scent of her lavender soap still lingered in the air. He had finally found his voice after 6 months. But the only person who mattered no longer wanted to listen. The real torment of Duke Edward had only just begun. Charlotte did not return to the nursery immediately. She walked briskly toward the Grand Master suite. Her posture was entirely straight and unwavering. She pulled a large leather trunk from the heavy wooden wardrobe. She began sorting through her personal belongings methodically. She only packed her simple cotton day dresses. She deliberately left behind every expensive silk gown Edward had purchased. She wanted nothing that carried the weight of his cold money. Mrs. Higgins appeared in the doorway of the bedroom. The head housekeeper gasped at the sight of the open trunk. Your Grace, whatever are you doing? The older woman asked nervously. I am moving my things to the East Wing, Charlotte replied evenly. But the East Wing is entirely isolated and drafty. It is far better than freezing to death in this empty room, Charlotte stated. Mrs. Higgins stood completely paralyzed by the sudden declaration. Before the housekeeper could argue, hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor. Duke Edward burst into the room. He was breathing heavily as if he had sprinted up the grand staircase. His eyes immediately fell upon the open leather trunk. Raw terror flashed across his pale face. Charlotte, stop, he commanded, his voice still painfully rough. You cannot leave this suite. Charlotte folded a linen chemise and placed it in the trunk. She did not even pause to look at him. You lost the right to give me orders 6 months ago, Edward. I am taking control of my own space now. She snapped the heavy brass locks of the trunk shut. The loud metallic click echoed sharply in the tense room. Edward quickly stepped directly into her path. He blocked the main doorway with his massive frame. He looked like a drowning man grasping at thin air. Please, he begged, the words sounding completely foreign in his mouth. The East Wing is no place for a pregnant woman. Let me send the carpenters and the weavers there first. I will rebuild it entirely for you and the child. Charlotte finally met his desperate gaze. Her eyes held no anger, only absolute indifference. I do not want your renovations. I just want you to stay entirely away from us. Edward flinched hard, as if she had driven a blade into his ribs. His broad shoulders visibly slumped in complete defeat. He slowly stepped aside to clear the doorway. He was entirely powerless against her cold resolve. Charlotte signaled for a footman to carry her trunk. She walked out of the room without looking back once. Edward stood alone in the Grand Master Suite. He stared blankly at the empty space in the wardrobe. The crushing reality of his actions finally settled over him. He had successfully driven his own wife away. Within 10 minutes, Edward stormed into the manor kitchens. The kitchen staff completely froze in absolute terror. The Duke had not set foot in the kitchens for years. He had also not spoken a single word in their presence since the wedding. Light every fireplace in the East Wing immediately, Edward ordered loudly. His rough voice boomed off the copper pots and stone walls. Bring the thickest wool blankets from the main treasury. Prepare the most nourishing bone broth we have. The servants scrambled like terrified mice to obey his sudden commands. They realized their silent, frozen master had suddenly awakened. Edward paced the stone floor like a caged beast. He closely watched the head cook prepare a small silver tray. He inspected the warm milk, the fresh bread, and the rich soup. He wanted to make sure everything was perfect for her. He remembered how pale she had looked standing by the window. He hated himself deeply for not noticing her pregnancy sooner. He dismissed the footman who tried to carry the food. Edward picked up the silver tray himself. He carried it carefully up the stairs and down the long corridor. He ignored the shocked stares of the maids in the hallway. He finally reached the heavy wooden door of her new sanctuary. He took a deep breath to steady his racing heart. He knocked softly on the sturdy wood. Charlotte, I brought you some warm food, he called out gently. You need to keep your strength up for the baby. He waited in the dimly lit hallway for a response. Complete silence greeted him from the other side. Then, he heard a very distinct, sharp sound. A heavy iron bolt slid firmly into its metal casing. She had locked the door from the inside. She was locking him out of her life entirely. Edward slowly lowered his hand from the doorframe. He stared blankly at the solid oak wood separating them. He gently placed the silver food tray on the floor. He did not turn around and walk away. He slowly slid his back down the rough stone wall. He sat directly on the freezing floorboards of the corridor. The proudest duke in the realm pulled his knees to his chest. He prepared to spend the entire night guarding her locked door. He listened intently to the faint sounds from inside the room. He heard the soft creak of the rocking chair moving. She was likely sitting by the empty cradle again. He desperately wished he could hear her sing that lullaby one more time. But he knew he had forfeited that right through his own cowardice. He closed his eyes and leaned his head against the cold wall. The bitter chill of the east wing seeped through his clothes. He welcomed the physical discomfort as a very small punishment. It was nothing compared to the emotional freezing she had endured. Hours passed slowly in the dark, silent manner. The candles in the hallway eventually sputtered and died. Edward remained completely still in the pitch-black corridor. Morning light eventually began to filter through the tall windows. Mrs. Higgins walked down the hall to check on the Duchess. The housekeeper stopped dead in her tracks. She could not believe the sight before her eyes. The Duke of Somerset was asleep on the bare floor. He looked completely exhausted and entirely defeated. He woke instantly at the sound of her approaching footsteps. He quickly stood up and smoothed his wrinkled coat. "Leave the tray," he instructed Mrs. Higgins quietly. "Knock gently and see if she requires anything else." He turned and walked away before Charlotte could open the door. He knew his presence would only upset her further. He had to find a way to prove his devotion through actions, not just words. The heavy winter storm raged outside the manor walls the next morning. Charlotte woke to the surprising sound of a crackling fire. The east wing bedroom was supposed to be freezing and damp. Instead, a massive fire roared brightly in the large stone hearth. She knew exactly who had ordered the servants to light it. She refused to let this small gesture soften her hardened heart. A sudden wave of severe nausea washed over her. She scrambled out of the bed and rushed toward the wash basin. The morning sickness was much worse than usual today. She gripped the edges of the wooden table until her knuckles turned white. She breathed heavily, trying to calm her violently churning stomach. The heavy oak door to her room suddenly swung open without a knock. Charlotte gasped and quickly wiped her mouth with a linen towel. She turned to see Lady Margaret standing in the doorway. Margaret was Edward's older aunt and a woman of immense cruelty. She had always despised Charlotte for coming from a lesser noble family. Margaret looked around the dusty East Wing room with obvious disgust. Her lips curled into a nasty, mocking sneer. "So the rumors are entirely true," Margaret said coldly. "My nephew has finally banished you to the servant quarters." Charlotte stood completely straight despite her lingering dizziness. She would never show weakness to a woman like Margaret. "This is my chosen sanctuary, not a prison," Charlotte replied firmly. Margaret let out a sharp, grating laugh that echoed in the room. "Do not lie to me, you pathetic little girl. The entire high society knows the Duke refuses to look at you. He has not spoken a single word to you since the wedding. You are nothing but a useless ornament in this grand estate." Margaret took a menacing step closer to Charlotte. Her sharp eyes suddenly darted downward to Charlotte's waist. Charlotte instinctively moved her hands to cover her lower abdomen. It was a small, defensive gesture, but Margaret caught it immediately. A wicked, triumphant gleam appeared in the older woman's eyes. "Well, well," Margaret whispered with vicious delight. "Are you hiding a dark little secret under that plain dress? A bastard child, perhaps? Because we all know Edward would never touch a woman he despises." Charlotte felt a blinding flash of absolute fury ignite in her chest. She did not think about the consequences of her next action. She raised her hand and slapped Margaret hard across the face. The sharp sound cracked like a whip in the tense silence. Margaret stumbled backward, her hand flying to her reddening cheek. "How dare you strike me?" Margaret shrieked like a wild animal. "I will have you thrown out into the snow for this." Margaret raised her own hand to strike Charlotte back. Charlotte did not flinch or back away from the impending blow. She braced herself to protect her unborn child at all costs. But the violent blow never actually came. A massive hand suddenly caught Margaret's wrist in mid-air. Duke Edward stepped into the room like a towering god of war. His dark eyes burned with an intense, murderous rage. He gripped his aunt's wrist so hard she cried out in pain. "Get out," Edward snarled. His voice was still rough, but it carried absolute, terrifying authority. Margaret stared at her nephew in complete shock. She had not heard him speak a single word in over 6 years. "Edward, she struck me first," Margaret protested weakly. "She is carrying a bastard child and hiding it from you." Edward did not release his punishing grip on her arm. Instead, he twisted it slightly, forcing her to her knees. "She is carrying the future Duke of Somerset," Edward declared loudly. "She is my wife, and she is the absolute master of this estate. If you ever speak a disrespectful word to her again, I will destroy you." He shoved Margaret roughly toward the open doorway. "Pack your belongings immediately and leave my lands. You are permanently banished from this family." Margaret scrambled away in absolute terror and fled down the hall. The heavy silence returned to the room instantly. Edward stood near the door, his chest heaving with exertion. He slowly turned his gaze toward Charlotte. The murderous rage in his eyes vanished, replaced by deep concern. Charlotte suddenly felt the room start to spin violently around her. The extreme stress in her morning sickness finally took their toll. Her knees buckled beneath her weight. She collapsed toward the hard wooden floorboards. Edward crossed the room in 2 massive strides. He caught her firmly in his strong arms before she hit the ground. His embrace was incredibly warm and fiercely protective. Charlotte leaned against his broad chest for a brief second. She inhaled his familiar scent of pine and leather. But the memory of her long, silent suffering quickly returned. She pushed against his shoulders with the last of her strength. "Let me go," she whispered weakly. Edward immediately loosened his grip, respecting her boundaries. He carefully guided her to the edge of the large bed. He knelt on the floor beside her, refusing to tower over her. "I will always protect you from them," Edward promised softly. "You do not need to fight these battles alone anymore." Charlotte looked down at the man kneeling beside her bed. He had defended her honor without a single moment of hesitation. He had publicly claimed their child with fierce, undeniable pride. It was a tiny, significant crack in the massive wall between them. "Your protection today does not erase 6 months of absolute neglect," she said. "I know," Edward replied, his voice filled with painful acceptance. "But I will spend the rest of my life trying to prove my worth to you." He did not try to touch her or force her to accept his apology. He simply stood up and quietly left the room to give her peace. Charlotte watched the door close, her heart pounding in her chest. She placed her hand over her racing heart and took a deep breath. She felt the tiny flutter of life deep within her womb. The baby had survived the intense confrontation without any harm. The image of Edward twisting his aunt's arm played in her mind constantly. He had looked like a completely different man in that desperate moment. The silent, indifferent ghost had transformed into a fierce, loyal guardian. But trust was a very fragile glass structure that shattered easily. Edward had destroyed it completely with his long, cruel silence. He could not glue it back together with a single act of defense. She walked over to the wash basin and splashed cold water on her face. The icy sting helped clear the remaining dizziness from her heavy head. She looked at her pale reflection in the small, polished silver mirror. She was no longer the naive girl who arrived here 6 months ago. She was a mother preparing for a lifelong war of independence. Edward would have to do much more than banish a cruel relative. He would have to bleed his soul dry to earn a place in their lives. She dried her face and walked back to the wooden rocking chair. She began to sing the lullaby once again into the quiet room. This time, she sang it with newfound strength and unyielding courage. The harsh winter slowly transitioned into a bleak, unforgiving spring. Charlotte remained entirely confined within the stone walls of the East Wing. Her violent morning sickness had gradually faded into a constant, exhausting weakness. She spent most of her long days sitting quietly by the frosted glass window. Her usually vibrant, flawless skin now held a translucent, sickly pallor. Duke Edward watched this silent, terrifying deterioration from a careful distance. He respected her boundaries and never crossed the threshold of her sanctuary again. But his sharp eyes noticed every single subtle change in her delicate frame. He saw exactly how heavily she leaned on the wooden banister when she walked. He noticed the deep, dark circles bruising the fragile skin beneath her beautiful eyes. Absolute panic slowly began to replace his initial, respectful patience. He could not just stand by and watch his wife wither away into nothingness. He immediately dispatched his fastest, most trusted riders directly to the royal capital. He ordered them to bring back Dr. Sterling, the most respected physician in the empire. He offered a king's ransom for the doctor's immediate arrival at the isolated estate. Dr. Sterling arrived at the massive manor exactly 3 days later, completely exhausted. Edward personally escorted the elderly, silver-haired doctor directly to the East Wing. He knocked softly on the heavy wooden door, his chest tight with agonizing dread. "Charlotte, I have brought a prominent physician from the capital," Edward called out through the wood. "I do not need your expensive doctors or your sudden charity," Charlotte's weak voice replied instantly. She still firmly believed this was just another elaborate form of his absolute control. She refused to be treated like a fragile, broken possession he suddenly wished to repair. Mrs. Higgins stood closely beside the Duke, wringing her white apron in deep distress. "Please, Your Grace," the housekeeper pleaded loudly enough for Charlotte to hear through the door. "You must set aside your pride and think of the little innocent one growing inside you." The mention of the unborn baby was the only key capable of unlocking Charlotte's stubborn resolve. The heavy iron bolt slowly slid back with a loud, grating metallic sound. Charlotte stood in the open doorway, looking smaller and more dangerously fragile than ever before. She completely ignored Edward's presence and looked only at the elderly, tired physician. "You may enter, Dr. Sterling," she whispered quietly, stepping aside to clear the path. Edward desperately tried to follow them into the warm, dimly lit room. Charlotte immediately held up a shaking, pale hand to stop his forward momentum. "Only the doctor," she commanded with absolute, freezing, undeniable finality. Edward stopped dead in his tracks and nodded tightly in silent, painful agreement. The heavy oak door closed firmly in his face once again, locking him out. Edward paced the cold stone corridor like a trapped, starving wolf in a cage. Every single passing minute felt like a physical, agonizing eternity to his tortured soul. He imagined every terrible, dark outcome possible regarding her fragile, failing health. He rubbed his temples roughly, desperately trying to erase the terrifying images from his mind. Nearly a full hour passed before the heavy wooden door finally creaked open again. Dr. Sterling emerged slowly, his weathered face etched with deep, grave concern. He carefully closed the door behind him to ensure Charlotte could not hear their conversation. Edward instantly stopped his frantic pacing and rushed toward the older man. "How is she?" Edward demanded, his rough voice completely devoid of its usual arrogant authority. "She is entirely exhausted, Your Grace," Dr. Sterling replied carefully, choosing his words. "Her physical constitution is severely weakened beyond what is normal for any pregnancy." Edward felt a cold, heavy stone drop straight into the bottom of his stomach. "Is it a disease?" he asked desperately, his dark eyes wide with terror. "Name the cure, tell me the price, and I will procure it immediately." The old physician shook his grey head slowly and sadly from side to side. "There is no simple potion or magical medicine for this specific ailment, Duke Edward. The Duchess is suffering from profound, deep-rooted, consuming melancholy. Her spirit has been completely starved of warmth, affection, and basic human connection. A delicate flower cannot possibly bloom in a frozen, barren wasteland. Edward physically recoiled as if the doctor had violently struck him across the jaw. The doctor's blunt, honest words confirmed his absolute worst, darkest nightmare. The prolonged emotional isolation has taken a severe, undeniable physical toll on her body. The child she currently carries is at a tremendous, immediate risk of being lost. If her environment and her spirit do not improve drastically, she will miscarry soon. And if that tragic event occurs, she likely will not survive the physical trauma either. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed the diagnosis was entirely unbearable. Edward stopped breathing as the devastating reality crashed down heavily upon him. His calculated silence. His twisted, cowardly attempt to protect her from his own inherited demons. That very silence was literally poisoning his wife and killing his unborn heir. He was not her silent protector, he was the primary executioner of his own family. A massive wave of absolute, sickening self-loathing washed over his entire soul. He had officially become the exact violent monster he had sworn never to be. He dismissed the grim doctor with a silent, trembling wave of his large hand. Edward stood completely alone in the dark hallway, staring blankly at the closed wooden door. He finally pushed the door open very slowly and stepped into the quiet nursery. Charlotte was sitting weakly in her rocking chair, her eyes closed in complete exhaustion. She did not even have the physical energy to demand that he leave the room immediately. Edward walked over slowly and knelt heavily beside her chair, keeping a respectful distance. He did not dare reach out to touch her pale hand or her swollen stomach. "The doctor told me everything," Edward whispered, his voice cracking with immense, raw pain. Charlotte slowly opened her eyes and looked at him with tired, hollow resignation. "So you finally know that your grand estate has truly become my graveyard," she replied softly. "It will not be," Edward vowed fiercely, a single, hot tear escaping his dark eyes. "I will pack my things tonight and move to the hunting lodge on the far edge of the estate. I will leave this manor entirely so you do not have to endure my suffocating presence. You will have absolute peace, you will have control, and you will not lose this child." Charlotte stared down at him, genuinely shocked by his drastic, sudden proposal. The proudest, most powerful duke in the realm was voluntarily exiling himself from his own home. He was entirely willing to give up everything he owned just to ensure she kept breathing. Duke Edward left the grand estate before the sun even rose in the sky. He took only his fastest horse and a single worn travel cloak. He left behind no specific instructions other than absolute obedience to his wife. The massive manor suddenly felt entirely different without his imposing shadow. A strange, quiet peace settled over the ancient stone walls immediately. Charlotte finally moved out of the freezing, damp east wing. She did not return to the Grand Master suite they had briefly shared. She chose a bright, sunlit room overlooking the blooming southern gardens. The heavy burden of constant, suffocating anxiety slowly lifted from her shoulders. Her violent morning sickness completely vanished within a single week. The healthy, pink flush gradually returned to her pale cheeks. She began walking through the endless hallways with her head held high. The servants immediately recognized her absolute authority over the entire household. She reviewed the heavy ledger books and managed the estate finances effortlessly. Dr. Sterling visited twice a month and praised her remarkable physical recovery. The baby was growing steadily stronger with every passing day. She had finally won her ultimate freedom and absolute safety. Yet, a strange, hollow void remained in the quiet corridors of the manor. Victory felt surprisingly cold when there was no one left to fight. Late one afternoon, Mrs. Higgins approached her in the grand library. The head housekeeper carried a small, heavy silver key on a velvet pillow. "The Duke left this for you before he departed," Mrs. Higgins said quietly. "It is the only key to his private, locked study. Charlotte stared at the shining metal with deep, lingering hesitation. Edward had always kept that specific room locked away from everyone. Curiosity eventually overpowered her stubborn, ingrained resentment. She took the cold key and walked slowly down the silent west corridor. She slid the key into the heavy brass lock and turned it carefully. The thick oak door swung open with a soft, eerie creak. The study was surprisingly simple and entirely devoid of lavish decorations. A massive mahogany desk sat directly in the center of the quiet room. She walked around the desk and noticed a large wooden chest on the floor. The heavy iron lid was unlatched, revealing the hidden contents inside. Charlotte knelt down awkwardly, carefully protecting her growing belly. She reached inside the chest and pulled out a small wooden object. It was a beautifully hand-carved wooden rocking horse. The craftsmanship was incredibly detailed and perfectly smooth to the touch. She reached in again and found a set of perfectly rounded alphabet blocks. Every single sharp edge had been painstakingly sanded down to prevent injury. Fresh wood shavings still lingered at the very bottom of the heavy chest. A small, sharp carving knife lay resting next to the wooden toys. Edward had made these himself during those long, silent, lonely evenings. He had been preparing carefully for a child he thought he did not deserve. Charlotte felt a sudden, sharp tightening deep inside her chest. She then noticed a thick, worn leather journal resting on the main desk. She stood up slowly and opened the heavy cover with trembling fingers. The thick parchment pages were filled with his sharp, elegant handwriting. She recognized the date on the very first page immediately. It was the exact evening of their grand, terrifyingly silent wedding day. "She is the most radiant creature I have ever seen," the first line read. "But I cannot speak a single word to her. If I open my mouth, the violent poison of my father might spill out." Charlotte gasped softly and turned the thick page with shaking hands. Entry after entry documented his intense, silent, agonizing daily struggle. He wrote about how much he desperately wanted to praise her beautiful dresses. He wrote about his burning desire to hold her hand during dinner. "My father used cruel words like sharp blades to slowly butcher my mother. He smiled warmly in public and screamed violently in the dark. I feel that same terrible, destructive anger boiling in my own blood. Absolute silence is the only cage strong enough to hold my inherited demons. I will starve my own heart to keep her completely safe from me." Charlotte read the final entry, written the exact night he found out about the baby. The handwriting was frantic, deeply pressed into the paper, and stained with watermarks. "I truly thought I was her shield, but I was actually her executioner. My silence almost killed the only two souls I have ever loved. I will leave tomorrow so she can finally breathe without my suffocating presence." A single, hot tear dropped from Charlotte's eye onto the faded black ink. She collapsed heavily into his large leather chair and wept openly. The monstrous, unfeeling Duke was nothing but a terrified, broken boy inside. His prolonged cruelty was never born of malice, arrogance, or hatred. It was a twisted, desperate sacrifice born of profound love and deep, paralyzing trauma. He had chosen to be hated by her just to ensure she remained unbroken. She clutched the small wooden horse tightly to her chest as she cried. The massive wall of ice in her heart finally cracked completely open. He had walked away into the freezing wilderness to give her sunlight. She gently wiped her tears and looked out the window toward the distant woods. The war of resentment was officially over. The sky above the grand estate quickly darkened into a bruised purple. A fierce spring thunderstorm was rolling rapidly across the distant hills. Charlotte stood in the main foyer wearing a thick woolen traveling cloak. She held the worn leather journal tightly against her chest like a shield. Mrs. Higgins wrung her hands nervously by the heavy oak front doors. The head housekeeper begged the young Duchess to wait for the morning light. The roads leading to the distant hunting lodge were notoriously treacherous during heavy rain. Dr. Sterling had strictly ordered her to avoid any severe physical strain. But Charlotte refused to spend another second sitting comfortably in the warm manor. Her husband was currently punishing himself in the freezing wilderness for a crime born of love. "Prepare the carriage immediately," Charlotte ordered the hesitant footman with absolute authority. "I am going to bring the Duke of Somerset back to his true home." The heavy wooden carriage lurched forward into the gathering darkness. Fat drops of icy rain began to violently lash against the glass windows. The wind howled through the ancient trees like a chorus of angry spirits. Charlotte placed one hand firmly over her stomach to steady her breathing. She felt a surprising surge of immense physical strength coursing through her veins. The knowledge of Edward's secret devotion had completely cured her lingering despair. She was no longer a fragile victim trapped in a cold, loveless marriage. She was a fierce mother fighting to save the father of her child. Suddenly, the carriage jolted violently to the right and came to a dead stop. The terrified horses whinnied loudly over the deafening cracks of thunder. The driver climbed down from his wooden perch into the pouring rain. He shouted loudly that the rear iron wheel was buried deep in thick mud. The carriage could not move another inch until the vicious storm completely passed. They were still at least a mile away from the isolated hunting lodge. The driver strongly suggested they remain safely inside the dry cabin until dawn. Charlotte did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She pushed the heavy carriage door open and stepped out into the raging storm. The icy rain instantly soaked the edges of her heavy woolen cloak. The thick mud immediately grabbed at her sturdy leather riding boots. The driver yelled in absolute panic, begging her grace to return to the carriage. Charlotte ignored his pleas and began walking purposefully down the dark, ruined road. She pulled the dark hood low over her face to shield her eyes from the stinging rain. Every single step required a tremendous amount of physical exertion. The forest shadows seemed to twist and reach out for her like skeletal claws. She focused her mind entirely on the small wooden rocking horse sitting in the study. She remembered the tear-stained pages of his agonizing, heartbreaking journal entries. He had survived a lifetime of silent terror just to keep her safe. She could easily survive 1 mile of bad weather to finally reach his side. Lightning flashed brilliantly, illuminating the jagged silhouette of the hunting lodge ahead. Her heart completely dropped into her stomach when she saw the stone building. There was absolutely no warm smoke rising from the tall stone chimney. No welcoming candlelight flickered in any of the small, square glass windows. The lodge looked entirely abandoned and swallowed by the surrounding darkness. Charlotte pushed her exhausted legs to move faster through the deep, slippery mud. She finally reached the heavy wooden door of the desolate cabin. She did not bother knocking. She pushed the heavy latch down and shoved the door wide open. The interior of the lodge was bitterly cold and completely swallowed in shadows. The unmistakable scent of damp wood and deep sickness hung heavily in the stale air. "Edward," she called out, her voice trembling slightly over the roaring thunder outside. A harsh, wet cough echoed from the far, dark corner of the main room. Charlotte quickly found a solitary wax candle on a nearby wooden table. She struck a match with shaking fingers and illuminated the freezing room. The terrifying sight before her completely shattered her newly mended heart. The mighty, arrogant Duke of Somerset was lying directly on the bare floorboards. He was not wearing his immaculate, tailored velvet coats or crisp linen cravats. He wore a single, damp shirt that clung tightly to his shivering, emaciated frame. He had clearly not eaten or slept properly since the day he left the Grand Manor. A massive pile of chopped firewood sat entirely untouched next to the empty hearth. He had intentionally denied himself the basic comfort of a warm fire. He was ruthlessly executing his own physical punishment for hurting her and the baby. Charlotte fell heavily to her knees beside his trembling, feverish body. She dropped the candle holder and reached out to touch his pale face. His skin was burning with an unnaturally high, dangerous fever. Edward slowly fluttered his dark eyes open, his gaze completely unfocused and hazy. He stared at her beautiful, rain-soaked face for a very long time. A sad, broken smile slowly formed on his chapped, bleeding lips. "The fever has finally brought me an angel," he whispered in a raspy, broken voice. He weakly raised a trembling hand to trace the air inches from her cheek. He deliberately stopped himself from actually touching her wet skin. "You are a very cruel hallucination," he murmured, his eyes filling with tears. "Go back to the sunlight before my inherited darkness destroys you too." He closed his eyes tightly, silently begging the beautiful phantom to disappear. Charlotte grabbed his burning, calloused hand, and pressed it firmly against her warm cheek. Edward gasped sharply as the physical contact shocked his fevered brain. "I am not a hallucination, you foolish, magnificent man," Charlotte said, tears streaming down her face. "I found the key, I read your journal, and I know everything now." Edward stared at her in absolute, paralyzed shock as the reality of her words settled in. The freezing shadows of the hunting lodge retreated as the first sparks caught the kindling. Charlotte worked with a frantic, desperate energy she didn't know she possessed. She ignored the sharp pain in her back and the exhaustion in her heavy limbs. She stoked the flames until the massive stone hearth roared with golden heat. The flickering light danced across Edward's hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. He remained on the cold floor, shivering violently despite the growing warmth. Charlotte fetched a wooden bucket of rainwater from outside the door. She used a strip of her own linen petticoat to bathe his burning forehead. Every time she touched him, Edward flinched as if the contact caused physical agony. "Please, Charlotte, you must leave this cursed place," he groaned through gritted teeth. "I can feel the dark blood of my father pulsing in my very veins. I am a danger to you, to the child, and to everything decent in this world." Charlotte grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to look directly into her eyes. "Listen to me, Edward Somerset," she said, her voice ringing with absolute iron. "A dangerous man does not freeze in the dark to save his wife's feelings. A monster does not carve tiny wooden horses for a baby he is afraid to meet. Your father was a coward who used his voice to destroy others. You are a fool who used your silence to destroy yourself. But you are not your father, and you never will be." Edward looked at her, his dark eyes brimming with a lifetime of repressed sorrow. "I was so terrified that if I spoke, I would eventually scream," he confessed. "I was so afraid that if I touched you, I would eventually strike you. I built a prison of silence to keep the beast locked deep inside." Charlotte pulled his large, trembling hand toward her stomach. She pressed his palm firmly against the gentle curve of her pregnancy. At that exact moment, the baby gave a sudden, distinct, and powerful kick. Edward froze, his breath hitching in his constricted throat. The physical connection to his child seemed to shatter the final layer of his internal ice. "He is waiting for you, Edward," Charlotte whispered, her voice softening with love. "Our son does not need a silent shadow hiding in the woods. He needs a father who is brave enough to be kind. He needs a man who can teach him that strength is found in gentleness." Edward let out a long, jagged sob that shook his entire massive frame. He finally stopped fighting her and collapsed into her protective embrace. He buried his face in the crook of her neck and wept like a broken child. He wept for his lost mother, for his stolen childhood, and for the 6 months he had wasted. Charlotte held him tightly, rocking him slowly back and forth in front of the fire. She didn't care that her dress was ruined or that the storm was still raging outside. The only thing that mattered was the warmth returning to his freezing skin. After a long time, Edward pulled back slightly and looked up at her. The terrifying haze of the fever had finally started to recede from his eyes. For the first time since their wedding, he looked at her without fear or guilt. He looked at her with a raw, overwhelming, and absolute adoration. "I love you, Charlotte," he said, his voice clear and steady for the very first time. "I have loved you from the second you walked down that aisle. I was just too much of a coward to tell the world, and too broken to tell you." Charlotte felt a wave of pure, radiant heat wash over her entire soul. Those 3 simple words carried more weight than all the silk and gold in the manor. They were the true cure for the deep-rooted melancholy that had almost killed her. "Then come home, Edward," she replied, kissing his fevered brow. "Come home and be the man I know you truly are." The storm outside began to lose its violent edge as the night wore on. The thunder faded into a distant, low rumble behind the dark hills. Inside the small lodge, the fire continued to burn bright and steady. Edward eventually fell into a deep, natural sleep, his head resting in Charlotte's lap. He didn't wake up screaming from nightmares of his father's rage. He slept peacefully, knowing that he was finally, truly seen. Charlotte watched over him until the first grey light of dawn touched the windows. She knew the road ahead would still require a great deal of patience and healing. Trauma that took a lifetime to build would not vanish in a single night. But they were no longer fighting the darkness in absolute, lonely silence. They were a family now, forged in the fire of the highest stakes. As the sun began to rise, Charlotte felt a profound sense of peace. The Duke had finally found his voice, and she had finally found her husband. The golden sun of midsummer bathed the Somerset estate in a brilliant, warm light. The once desolate southern gardens were now an explosion of vibrant red roses. The heavy, oppressive silence that had defined the manor for years was officially gone. Instead, the sound of cheerful laughter and melodic music echoed through the open windows. Charlotte stood on the grand marble balcony, looking healthier and more radiant than ever. Her beautiful eyes sparkled with a deep, unshakable sense of peace and fulfillment. She watched the servants busily preparing the lawn for a magnificent celebration. Today was the christening of their first child, a perfect, healthy baby girl. They had named her Lillian, a symbol of the new life blooming in their hearts. Charlotte remembered the terrifying hours of labor just 1 month ago. Edward had refused to leave her side for even a single, fleeting second. He had ignored the protests of the midwives and the strict rules of noble tradition. He had knelt by her bed, holding her hand with a fierce, trembling strength. He had whispered thousands of soft, encouraging words into her ear during every contraction. "You are the bravest soul I have ever known," he had murmured repeatedly. "Thank you for fighting for our family, my beautiful Charlotte." When the baby's first sharp cry had filled the room, Edward had openly wept with joy. He had been the first one to hold their daughter, cradling her with incredible gentleness. The man who once feared his own hands would cause harm was now a master of tenderness. Now, as guests began to arrive in their finest silk carriages, the excitement was palpable. The high society of the empire had spent months whispering about the strange Duke. They had expected to see a broken marriage and a neglected, lonely Duchess. Instead, they were greeted by a sight that left them completely breathless with envy. Duke Edward stood at the entrance of the grand ballroom, looking magnificent and proud. He wore his formal velvet regalia, but his sharp eyes were fixed entirely on his wife. When Charlotte entered the room, the entire crowd fell into a hushed, stunned silence. She looked like a celestial queen in her gown of shimmering gold and cream lace. Edward immediately crossed the vast room to meet her halfway. He did not offer a cold, formal bow as dictated by the rigid protocols of the court. He took her hand and leaned down to press a lingering, devoted kiss to her knuckles. "You look absolutely breathtaking today, my love," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. The guests began to whisper frantically behind their decorative feathered fans. They had never heard the Duke speak with such raw, unabashed emotion before. As the ceremony began, Edward stood before the gathered nobility with his head held high. He held his sleeping daughter in his arms while Charlotte stood closely by his side. "Many of you have heard rumors about the silence in this house," Edward began firmly. His voice carried a commanding, resonant power that filled every corner of the hall. I spent a long time trapped in a darkness of my own making. I was a man who didn't understand that love is a fire that must be shared. But my wife, Charlotte, saw the man I was too afraid to become. She braved the cold, the silence, and even a violent storm to save my soul. Everything I have, and everything I am, belongs entirely to her. She is the true heart of Somerset, and the greatest blessing of my life. A wave of genuine shock and admiration swept through the crowded ballroom. The women who had once mocked Charlotte now looked at her with profound respect. The men who had feared the Duke's silence now saw a man of incredible character. Edward turned to Charlotte, his gaze softening into a look of absolute, pure adoration. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. Inside was a necklace featuring a massive, flawless blue diamond shaped like a drop of water. A reminder that the ice has finally melted, he whispered as he fastened it around her neck. Charlotte smiled, her heart overflowing with a happiness she once thought impossible. She leaned in and kissed him softly, ignoring the hundreds of watching eyes. The long, agonizing winter of their marriage was officially a distant, fading memory. They spent the rest of the afternoon walking through the sun-drenched gardens together. Edward carried Lillian, pointing out the colorful butterflies dancing among the roses. He spoke constantly now, sharing his dreams, his thoughts, and his endless love. The mute Duke had become the most attentive and eloquent husband in the kingdom. Charlotte realized that her singing in the nursery had been more than just a lullaby. It had been a beacon of light that guided a drowning man back to the shore. They stopped near the ancient oak tree where the swing had been newly repaired. "Will you sing to her tonight?" Edward asked, his voice filled with gentle hope. "Only if you stay and listen," Charlotte replied, her hand resting on his arm. "I will always stay," Edward vowed, pulling her closer to his side. "I will never let the silence find us again." The sun began to set, casting a warm, orange glow over the peaceful estate. The three of them stood together, a perfect portrait of a family finally made whole. The Duke had finally found his voice. The Duchess had finally found her home. And their child would grow up in a world filled with nothing but the music of love. The Duke believed silence was a shield protecting his wife, unaware that this silent coldness was the sharpest blade capable of wounding deeply. In relationships, we often use the guise of "for your own good" to hide our true feelings in secret diaries, forgetting that what the other person needs is never a perfect shadow, but a warm embrace. If you were in his shoes, would you forgive this 6-month-long emotional abuse? Even if his initial intention was deep love, the most frightening thing in a relationship isn't arguing, but silence. Follow Luna's Secret Library to unravel those unexpected and heartwarming moments deep within human nature every day, and learn how to love through these stories.